Hi, and welcome to the Cornelius Seed Podcast. Thank you for checking out our podcast. Established in 1935, we're an American-owned and family-owned independent seed company. And we're excited to partner with you by bringing you 5 generations of agricultural experience and decades of industry expertise. In our podcasts, you can expect to gain valuable and timely information to aid you in making decisions for your operation. We'll keep things simple and informative, and much like our motto, planet, profit. Welcome back to the Cornelius Seed Podcast. This is Juan Camacho, Cornelius Seed Innovation Lead, and I'm joined by Craig Allaman, our lead agronomist. In this episode, we're going to get a planting season update, but we're really want to put this one out today because of some recent weather events that have come across, Cornelius country, and the western side of Iowa has been, eastern Nebraska have really been saturated lately. And so questions are coming in from 2 fronts of, if I haven't got my seed in the ground, is it time yet to change maturities? And other ones of the folks that did get the seed in the ground. It's a big intro there, but just wanted to jump on in and kick us off.
Yeah, we've been dealing with the delayed planting issue for a while now this year. We've fought just kind of pretty consistent rain events passing through the Corn Belt in general, but for sure our footprint that we really look at across Iowa and eastern Nebraska and southern Minnesota, southern Wisconsin, and across northern 2/3 of Illinois. And so we've been talking a little bit about when it gets to that point in time, gets to be late May, and we start thinking about switching maturities, getting some earlier maturities in there. What would be the plan there? But then now, all of a sudden, we went from 1/2 inch to 1 inch range to some of these 5 to 7 inches like we've had in the last couple of days, and so that brings that delays planting more in areas where they haven't got it in. So we're definitely going to get into that time frame where maturities come into question. But now we're talking about ponding and crusting and things like that, and potential replants and so forth. So kind of the last couple of days kind of got things sped up a little bit and shifted to a different level. So there's a lot of concerns out there that we're looking at now that are going to potentially affect getting started out with a good start on our crop.
What do you? I'm curious. What would you say? What does the last report say that? What is our current corn planting progress for the?
I'm not sure across the belt there, but I just read Iowa State's extension. They do an update. I think it's on a weekly basis this time of the year, and most of those regions, they're broken down into several regions, and most of those are that's 70 to 80 to even 90% on corn, and then more like a 50 to 60, 70% on beans. And that's probably pretty close. Obviously some areas are mostly done probably with both crops, and other areas are, lagging pretty far behind. They just kind of keep getting those rains. And so I'd say that's pretty close to where we're at. Corn that's not in the ground now will start having a pretty big yield penalty. Beans have a little bit more time, and possibly, potentially, depending on the weather, more ways to compensate that yield. Although, certainly we've been getting a nice yield bump with early planted soybeans, and that window's long closed now. So if you haven't got those beans in yet, you won't have that bump that you get from early planted beans this year.
Okay. So then if someone's been out of the field, what should be priority? And they've got both crops.
Well, you're going to have a bigger penalty for corn. So, probably since late May or late April, early May, we would have switched to where corn would be the priority to get in first. So that, that's definitely where we're at now. That corn's got a much bigger penalty for late planting than what soybeans do. And again, those soybeans have so many different ways to compensate, later on through the year and during stress periods that, you can get a decent soybean yield planting in mid-June if the weather is favorable the rest of the year.
Okay. Well, so then with corn being priority and whatnot, what are we? I even hate suggesting it and thinking about. Do we stay with our plan? Does it maximize now the yield potential with what we have, or is there a bump by switching maturities?
Yeah, recent studies, more in recent years with, modern hybrids, that May 25th is the date that we start thinking about switching maturities. And with soybeans, it's going to be more like the 10th or so of June. And with corn, I guess my biggest recommendation is don't overcompensate yet. Um, we use some corn that's just way out of our maturity range and maybe has not even been used much down in our north to south range when we're talking about a real late replant or something like that, say mid-June or so. But right now, if the next time it dries out and you get back in the field, definitely going to pull out those earlier maturity or those fuller season hybrids, and hopefully you've got those planted. But let's just say if I had a customer that was planting 105 to 110 day, that was their normal maturity range. Now, if it looks like they're not going to make it back into the field until June, first part of June, once it dries out here, I'm still recommending they would stay at that maybe 104 to 106, because you're going to take a big yield hit if you jump down too much in maturity. And the corn naturally will catch up a little bit. It's going to know, by day length and everything else that it's later in the season, and it's going to shorten up the time it takes to get to maturity. That's the natural process that the corn plant will do. So you've got that going in your favor, and you want to stay as full of maturity as you can because that's where your yield is for your, whatever your location is. So don't get too drastic yet. If we get rain again and you're knocked out again, and then we do start talking about that mid-June, if you're not doing a prevent plant, you're going to stick with corn and not switch to soybeans, then we would be talking about, in that example, maybe getting down to 100-day type product.
Okay, so we kind of started off talking about two approaches we were taking to this podcast, which was, what do we do before the seeds in the ground, and I think there you're pretty much saying if you've got both corn and soybeans yet to do, we're now at the point where corn not being in the ground is going to take the biggest hit, so we should prioritize that, and really, stay with the plan until that last week of May, or May 25th, as you said, before you start to looking into, whether you should start, changing to maturity ranges. Let's move on to the seed that is in the ground. I mean, we've gotten some pictures over from Denny Keneally out in western Iowa that there's just the creeks up, flush with the road, and it's really wet. And how long can that seed survive, under those conditions? And just let's kick that off.
Okay. Hey, before I get into that, on the soybean maturity, it is important there. Used to be when we were planting really late, and maybe it's a double crop situation, we'd go kind of ultra full on the maturity. But the recommendation nowadays is stick with that mid range of what you're normally planting. So if you were planting a 3-4 or a 2-4 to a 3-0, let's say, then if you're planting late on into June, you're going to want to, plant something like a 2-6, 2-7 in the middle of that range. So it's a little different than corn. Soybean being an indeterminate growth habit, it's a little bit different in how that plant's going to react to planting late. So side note on that, but back to your question on particularly on ponding, and especially we've got a lot of crop that's emerged out there. The early planted corn across the state of Iowa There's probably some stuff that's V3, but there's a lot of V1, V2. Soybeans, there's some V1 and soybeans, but a lot of VCs and newly emerged soybeans. So now we've got these ponds of water on it. We've got 5 to 7 inches of rain in a lot of places there in the overnight. And so the question is, how long will it survive first? And on corn, it's pretty easy. Corn is about 4 days. Beans, maybe not quite that long, but maybe it just kind of depends on, how big those beans were, how much of the bean was covered up, is it completely underwater, that kind of a thing. But it's a pretty cut and dried 4 days with corn. And the temperature is important there. If it's 77 degrees and above, it's maybe not going to be quite 4 days. It's going to go a little quicker. But if it's cooler, it'll be that 4 full days. So that water's, you can't see the crop, it's over it, and it's off of it in a couple days. You've got a pretty good shot for survival there. And with ponded out areas, probably give it a good 5 days to kind of see what recovery is going to be like. And then you're going to get out in there and dig some plants up, see what the roots look like, split it open there, see what the growing point. It should just be that a little bit of off-white, kind of cream color naturally. If it starts to get into a brownish look, and then, you may have death in that growing point. So, and then we're into, the decisions of what are we going to do for replant and things like that. It's tough when you replant those ponded areas. My experience has been you probably have one shot to replant it. So you're going to wait until it dries out, and if you can do some tillage on it, it's good to crack that. That soil surface is going to be so ran together and saturated and tight. If you can crack that open to help oxygen get down to the new seedlings that you plant, or to the roots, of the existing plants, a cultivator, a rotary hoe, something like that. That's a big help for sure. So, but you've got about one chance to plant those potholes that have drowned out. And if it doesn't take that second time and you get wiped out again, you probably ought to just leave it. You're probably not going to have a big success as late in the year as that's going to be. But that's what we're looking at. It's never fun. You always like to get that crop up and get a great stand across the whole field and nothing drowned out. And,
well, yeah. And so you talked about, that crop being up and being in different stages right now. Is there a particular stage that's more worrisome than the other in terms of it being underwater?
Well, with corn, if you get older than a V6 corn plant and you get that complete flooding over the top of it, then it's the death is going to come a lot quicker there. That's probably half the time. So there can be differences with that. But, everything that's in the field right now, there's not going to be a lot of difference. The difference is how quick the water gets back off of it.
Okay. Well, and that's a good way to recap that. I know you send out a notice to the team of that it's important to scout and give it a good 3 to 5 days after the water's receded. And I'm sure no one's excited about going out there and getting all muddied up anyways.
Yep.
You really highlight that pulling up those seedlings and look at that growing point that you're talking about.
Yeah, you're going to need to be then monitoring those areas in the fields or those fields the rest of the year, because you got that saturated soil in there, and that's just a good environment for especially the water. The things like fusarium, pythium, things that the spores swim in water and get to the roots. Those things are going to be really active in those saturated soils. And so once those diseases set in, they can harm the roots and harm up to the plant. But then, fusarium is usually the causal agent to having crown rot later in the season, which we saw a ton of that last year, across our footprint. And, looks like we could be set up to be seeing a bunch of that again this year with these heavy rains at the seedling stage.
Yeah. That kind of talks about, the testament of, and you've covered this in other podcasts, is our switch to Viantis, which at that point is, best known defense for Pythium. And this is kind of the year where we're having that treatment on the seed. will be on your side for sure.
Yeah,
yeah, and I kind of put that down as you were talking, was that, when you were talking about the environment and the water, I'm like, oh, there's the disease triangle you talk about and we keep an eye on.
Yep.
You kind of already said it there with watching out for crown rot, but those areas that you do know, what are some of those diseases that we're going to have to keep an eye on, that we want to make sure we're prepared to have, whether it's going to need an application of a fungicide or something?
Yeah. Your normal, your fungal diseases that'll set in on the leaf later on. We're a little bit early for that to probably affect that very much, but you could see things like crazy top, which happens when we get soil in the whorl, and normally when crops are completely underwater in flooded situations like this, so that could be pretty prevalent, something that we'll definitely see a little bit more this year. But other diseases, that's probably mainly going to set in later in the season. Although physoderma, usually sets in at that, I'm going to say V5 to V9 stage, and that happens with water pooled in the whorl, usually from heavy rain events, and then that causal agent of that disease is also a water. It swims in the water as well, so that's when we do get some physoderma brown spot, and you'll see that on the leaf then later on. And but the big problem with that is node breakage. Right late in the season, right ahead of maturity. So we definitely could. We haven't seen a bad case of physoderma in probably 3-4 years now, and we could sure see some of that this year.
I mean, you're talking about the plant survival and now disease a little bit, and you kind of even hit on some soil crusting, especially if you're replanting. If you're able to work something up, that'd be great. What about things like a nitrogen loss? Is there anything we can do to handle that? I mean, this is one of those years where if you had a biological like the Pivot Bio on seed, promotes no leaching and runoff.
Yeah, the biologicals, this would be an example of an advantage they would have, whether it's the Proven 40 from Pivot or there's a couple other products. I know Corteva has one, and they're already either colonized on the roots or inside the plant producing their nitrogen, and so that's going to be a big advantage. And Vita is another one of those products. So they're already in there. They're not going to get washed away. If you got the nitrate form, that's the form that we hit, that's always susceptible to loss. So right now, heavy rains would be leaching nitrate down in the soil. Nitrate is an NO3 molecule, and so also there's a lot. There's going to be multiple microbes, whether it's bacterias or whatever that are in the soil. Some of them are, the bacteria that break down our organic matter, mineralizing it, and if they get in saturated soils, they need oxygen to survive, and they will rob some of those oxygen ions off of that NO3, and then they turn that nitrogen into a gas when they do that. So that's why we don't like to have any more nitrogen in the nitrate form that we can, but there's always going to be some in there, even if it's natural mineralized nitrogen from the soil. So we can expect in those saturated areas to have lost a fair amount of the nitrates that are in there. You can do a late spring soil nitrate test, and you can just search for that online. It's a pretty extensive process, but you can pull soil samples, send it into a lab. It's important to get those samples in there quickly. Otherwise is not going to be very accurate, but it will give you an indication in those saturated areas how much nitrogen you need to apply based on what's still in the soil. So that is a tool you can use, or at least just plan on probably those saturated areas, adding some nitrogen back into those areas.
heard you shuffling papers whenever you were thinking of the other company doing that, which I think is pretty cool because it just goes to show you in your role, keeping an eye on everything. Even if we don't carrying it, you're still testing things and making sure we're on the latest and greatest.
Yeah, particularly looking, the Envita was escaping me. The Utrisha N is the one that Corteva has. I'm not as familiar with that one. Of course, the Proven 40 we offer as a seed treatment, and that's colonizing on the roots. The Envita is going to go inside the entire plant. So it'll be in the roots, but also in the rest of the plant. And, so there's some good options out there. And, we try not to get locked into any one thing. We try to, we think is do as good a job as we can of studying these things and offer what we think is best to our customers. So, it's an interesting field. I think we're just really starting to get into these biological nitrogen producers, and we're getting about 25% of our nitrogen needs from them right now. And I think the potential's there to at least double that, if not more, potentially what they can produce someday. So,
well, that's a bright future, especially when you think about wanting to get back out there and replant and waiting for the soil to be just right. If it's not, compaction and tomahawk roots and all those other things that come with it, that if it can keep you from going back out there and doing it at passive nitrogen, then it's helpful for everybody.
Yep.
What else, Craig? Are you, what other kind of questions or concerns or I mean, I know our DSM team, if they're feeling a lot, and then if they need some support, they're reaching out to you. Is there anything that we haven't talked about?
Well, I think we've covered these issues pretty well. We were concerned coming out of what I would call almost no winter. We had about a week worth of winter there in mid-January, and we had snow cover, in a lot of places during that week. So we've not done a lot to deplete any of our insect populations that overwinter up here. So, that's kind of shown us that in fact we are going to have a heavy insect pressure this year. The gnats that don't really bother our field, but they bother me when I'm outside looking at fields, swarming me. They were pretty heavy when they came in this year. So the next thing that's right around the corner, as soon as we start seeing the fireflies fly at night, the lightning bugs, that's an indication
right?
we've had enough growing degree units that the rootworm larva will start hatching. So that's generally last week in May, first week in June, depending on where you're at geographically. So would expect a pretty heavy pressure. We've had heavy pressures in continuous corn areas across Iowa last couple years. We had pretty good amount of the first year, the variant called extended diapause, which is the northern corn rootworm, had probably the biggest outbreak of that clear across the state of Iowa again. So it's time to, mid-June, we need to be digging some roots and evaluating our management programs and deciding what's working and what we need to change. We've had a couple pretty good tools. We've had the Smart Stack Pro, which brought in a new mode of action that so far has done a great job of letting way fewer, almost down to no adult beetles escape it. And that's going to help us get ahead of that heavy pressure over time. And then we have started testing. There's a N314 product, which is a biological. We tested it a little bit last year and in a bigger scale this year. Ever be a standalone product, but when we get heavy pressures where we're using a trade and still getting overwhelmed, that might be the next combination product to be able to put in combination with a trade or in combination with a regular insecticide and get do a good job on those heavier pressure fields. So insects need to keep our eyes open. We're right in the cutworm time frame, so we need to be watching for that. Get out there on our four-wheelers and get across all your fields back to the back corner and all that kind of thing. So That would
Okay.
be the only thing else I have.
No, good. With one of the things whenever we were talking about folks that still need to plant and or finish up rather, do they need to? I was just thinking as we're waiting for fields to dry out, and do we need to adjust planting depth to be ready to rock and roll when it's time to go? Any kind of tips on that you got?
Well, I guess the only there's nothing when you get that other than if you were happen to be finishing up in some drier conditions and had that planter set down 2.5, 2 3/4 inches or something like that, you're probably not going to need to do that when you come back into these drowned out areas. So maybe set it back up to where you started with, but otherwise I wouldn't adjust anything on that. It shouldn't change. It shouldn't change planter settings.
Good. Well, I think we hit a lot of it there, Craig, and I'll go through and in the show notes here, I'll kind of copy the notification that the team sent out today, that which kind of prompted this podcast, and encourage folks that if you want to get these, we call it solutions for your fields, and we're really just talking about a lot of what we're talking about now. And so if you want to sign up, go on to corneliusseed.com, and right in the middle of the page there's a sign up button, and we'll get you taken care of. We don't sell your information or any of that. You can also find us on Instagram and X and Facebook, so reach out and connect with us. But anyways, that's all I have, Craig. Thank you. I know you've got some folks to go see, and I appreciate your time, and I'm sure we'll connect here soon for the next one, and talk about what we need to be looking for as we have those fireflies out in the fields again, and kind of recap on some of that.
Yep, I'm probably likely going to be spending some time out in central Iowa next in some of these areas we've just been talking about. So we things to discuss next week.
Yep. Well, thanks again, Craig. I appreciate it, and you be safe out there. For those folks who are still planning or getting back out there, take your time and be safe, and until the next one.